I'm Ted Koppel. What can be done to prevent nuclear war? That's our focus tonight on a special edition of ABC News Viewpoint. We'll hear from Secretary of State George Shultz, and we'll discuss the issues with Henry Kissinger, Carl Sagan, Elie Wiesel, Brent Scowcroft, William F. Buckley Jr., and Robert McNamara. Our live audience here in Washington will ask questions on Viewpoint. That's next on ABC.
Thousands of students have passed through the doors of this school. Tomorrow at 6, I'll introduce you to the woman who made it all possible.
I'm surprised that so many principals feel that anybody can teach the remedial children. They need the best teachers. They need the strongest teachers. But invariably, they don't get them.
Meet this special woman tomorrow at 6 on Newswatch 13.
The federal government earned more than $2.5 billion in tobacco taxes in a recent year. 3.5 million smokers kicked the habit in 1980. Today, 66% of the smoking population would like to quit, according to the American Lung Association. North Carolina's tobacco crop was worth nearly $2 billion to the state alone. Deborah Potter explains what all this adds up to for many tobacco farmers. See Tobacco Crossroads, beginning Wednesday at 6 on Newswatch 13.
On Love Connection, singles are cuddling up for fall.
I was on her like a duck on a June bug.
More like a cheap suit.
Romance is in the air.
He said, "Can I kiss you goodnight?" And I said, "No."
Single people are dating again.
It's sort of a business trip. Let's put it that sort of atmosphere.
Share the ups and downs of the single scene
I'm ready.
every day on Love Connection.
Make a Love Connection with TV 13, weekdays at 9.
Good evening, I'm Steve Stoller. Tonight at 11:30, we'll examine how children deal with the threat of nuclear war. And we'll have a report on how to keep physically fit during the cold winter ahead. Stay with me.
Barney Miller, tonight after Newswatch Update.
This is an ABC News special edition of Viewpoint. Here now, reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
There is, and you probably need it about now, there is some good news. If you can, take a quick look out the window. It's all still there. Your neighborhood is still there, so is Kansas City, and Lawrence, and Chicago, and Moscow, and San Diego, and Vladivostok. What we have all just seen, and this was my third viewing of the movie, what we've seen is sort of a nuclear version of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. Remember Scrooge's nightmare journey into the future with the spirit of Christmas yet to come? When they finally return to the relative comfort of Scrooge's bedroom, the old man asks the spirit the very question that many of us may be asking ourselves right now. Whether, in other words, the vision that we've just seen is the future as it will be or only as it may be. Is there still time? To discuss, and I do mean discuss, not debate, that and related questions tonight, we are joined here in Washington by a live audience and a distinguished panel of guests. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Elie Wiesel, philosopher, theologian, and author on the subject of the Holocaust, William F. Buckley Jr., publisher of the National Review, author and columnist, Carl Sagan, astronomer and author who most recently played a leading role in a major scientific study on the effects of nuclear war, Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft, National Security Advisor to President Ford, chairman of President Reagan's Bipartisan Commission on the MX missile, and former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who wrote in the current edition of Foreign Affairs that nuclear weapons are totally useless except only to deter one's opponent from using them. That's our panel, and you'll be hearing from them in just a few moments. But first, joining us live from his home in suburban Washington is the Secretary of State, Mr. George Shultz. Mr. Secretary, if I put to you the question that Scrooge put to the spirit of Christmas yet to come, the future as we've just viewed it tonight, is that the future as it will be or only the future as it may be?
Neither. That is not the future at all. The film is a vivid and dramatic portrayal of the fact that nuclear war is simply not acceptable. And that fact and the realization of it has been the basis for the policy of the United States for decades now. the successful policy of the United States, based on the idea that we simply do not accept nuclear war, and we've been successful in preventing it.
Mr. Schultz, that is the answer of a Secretary of State to a reporter, and that's fair enough because that's what you and I respectively are. But what if you were answering the question to your son or to your granddaughter? What would a grandfather, what would a George Schultz who is talking to a member of his family say in response to the same question? Same answer?
Well, I would give the same answer. And since children these days are in many respects smarter, it seems to me, than their elders, they would ask a lot of questions about that. And I think it's possible to explain why it is that it's possible to have a policy that prevents nuclear war.
I guess what some of those smart youngsters are worried about and what a lot of smart older people are worried about too is not so much the policy, but just the presence of so many nuclear weapons, so many nuclear warheads in the world. And the question, which I now address to you, with so many of them, is it not inevitable that at some point or another they will be used? And if not, why do we need them?
The only reason that we have nuclear weapons, as President Reagan said in Japan recently, is to see to it that they aren't used. We have to provide a balance so that others who have nuclear weapons, particularly the Soviet Union, realize that what could happen to us could happen to them and would happen to them. And under those circumstances, neither we nor they will use these weapons. In this sense, I'm agreeing with the quotation that you gave from Secretary McNamara. But I think we have to do a lot more, and do a lot more. We work to reduce the number of these weapons, and it is interesting to note, important to note, that if you go back to the 1960s and compare the amount of destructive capability of our nuclear arsenal now as compared with them, that it's about 70% less. The point that I'm trying to make here is that in addition to having this policy of balance and deterrence, we have a policy of reduction. And in President Reagan's efforts to deal with this problem, reduction of nuclear weapons has been at the top of his list. Reduction all the way down to the point of zero.
Mr. Secretary, I cannot doubt, nor do I, that that is the President's intention. Why has that policy been so difficult to achieve then? Because since your administration has come into office, there has not been any reduction on either side.
Well, no, that's not correct. There have been some reductions as part of a general program to do so, and only last October it was announced that another 1,000 nuclear weapons or warheads would be taken out of Europe. So that process goes on. But it's also true that the negotiations that have been going on with the Soviet Union, while they haven't produced a result as yet, have focused on reduction. And many people said when the President proposed reductions that he shouldn't do that because the Soviets wouldn't agree to it. Well, they haven't agreed, but they have come to the table to talk about the subject.
Mr. Secretary, let me focus for a couple of minutes at least before we go to our panel here on the movie, which became, in a sense, much more than a movie. It's become a national event, and your presence here this evening is, I think, some testimony to that. Is the movie going to be useful?
Well, the movie certainly dramatizes the unacceptability of nuclear warfare. And from my standpoint, it says to those who have criticized the President for seeking reductions that really that's the sensible course to take. And what we should be doing is rallying around and supporting, as I think people, by and large, more and more are, the idea that we should be trying to reduce the numbers of these weapons. Of course, to do so means that we have to persuade the Soviet Union to come down along with us. And hopefully, what we would shoot for, as the President again said in Tokyo, his dream is to reduce down to zero.
There does seem to be a certain amount of business as usual, though, Mr. Secretary, in the most lamentable way, by which I mean the Soviets are pointing the finger at us, and we are pointing the finger at them, and somehow the moral imperative of arms reduction is going nowhere. Why?
It is a subject that we are working on constantly. We have made some very good and interesting proposals. I think that the point for us is to stay there and keep talking. And the moral imperative that we feel, I'm sure is felt by others throughout the world, no doubt including people in the Soviet Union. And so if we are persistent and the propositions we put are reasonable as they are, we will eventually get somewhere.
Let me bring it back to the family level for a moment. Those mothers and fathers out there who I suspect want a great many answers themselves and would like to be able to give answers to their own children. Is there anything that American citizens can do? Is there anything that you would like them to do? And maybe those are two separate questions.
Well, I think that clearly this question has been and is and it will continue to be a matter of great importance. And it seems to me the effort to reduce the numbers of these weapons around in the world, here and elsewhere, particularly the Soviet Union, is the right thing to do. And so the more widespread the support is for that, and the greater the understanding there is for that, the more chances we have for success.
I'm not
so
sure.
I think it is a subject that everyone should be paying attention to and registering in on, and that will be helpful.
Well, forgive me, I wasn't asking about paying attention, but whether people can do anything. I mean, other than what I suppose I would have expected you to say, and that is support the president's policy. Is there anything else that people can do?
Well, it isn't simply the president's policy. The proposals that have been put forth in both of the Geneva negotiations are widely supported. The one that deals with so-called intermediate range weapons is based on proposals developed with our allies in Europe and are closely coordinated with members of Congress so that they know what's going on. The same thing can be said for the other discussions that are taking place. In fact, I think it's a fair statement that members of Congress contributed a great deal to the so-called bill-down proposal. That's the most recent proposal put forward at Geneva by our negotiator, General Rowney.
Secretary Schultz, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And so we move now to our panel. And let me begin with you, Mr. Buckley. You have been quite eloquent in your denunciation of the movie that we saw this evening.
As usual.
Now that you have seen it, do you feel encouraged to become even more vociferous in your denunciation, or have you found some merit in it?
Well, I think unhappily the Secretary of State misses the point. The whole point of this movie is to launch an enterprise that seeks to debilitate the United States.
May I ask you just to move in a little closer to your microphone?
It seeks to debilitate the United States. This is terribly plain. The guy who wrote it says, I would like to see people starting to question the value of defending this country with a nuclear arsenal. That is his motive, and people who have seen the film, who have sought to debilitate American defenses, have gathered around it. It's become a cause militant. It has a totemic significance. And I'm delighted to hear the Secretary of State say such calm and lucid and cogent things, but it's unrelated to the effort of this film.
You think that there is a deliberate political effort behind this film, or are you prepared to concede that if indeed there is one, it may be accidental?
Well, it's certainly deliberate on the part of the writer. He says that was his motives. Now, if you say, was it deliberate on the part of the shareholders of ABC, I don't think they were consulted. But there's no question that people who seek to write tendentious copy because they seek to forward a particular point of view. I certainly do.
All right, let me raise the question, Carl Sagan. You see any merit in this movie, or is the movie simply an exercise in emotionalism which may cause despair rather than do anything useful?
I think in this country we've been sleepwalking during the last 38 years. and past this problem without really coming to grips with how dire and compelling it is. And I think ABC should be congratulated for spurring what I hope will be a year-long debate on this issue. But it's my unhappy duty to point out that the reality is much worse than what has been portrayed in this movie, and this new emerging reality has significant policy implications. The nuclear winter that will follow even a small nuclear war, especially if cities are targeted, as they almost certainly would be, involves a pall of dust and smoke which would reduce the temperatures not just in the northern mid-latitudes, but pretty much globally to sub-freezing temperatures for months. In addition, it's dark. The radiation from radioactivity is much more than we've been told before. Agriculture will be wiped out, and it's very clear that beyond the 1 or 2 billion people who would be killed directly in a major nuclear war, 5,000, 7,000 megatons, something like that, the overall consequences would be much more dire, and the biologists who've been studying this think that there is a real possibility of the extinction of the human species from such a war.
Let me stop you on that point, because if our viewers were not depressed enough after seeing the movie, I suspect you've brought them to an even greater nadir.
But I think that's good news, Mr. Koppel.
What is that?
What he just said is very good news.
Because?
If the Soviet Union knows that a first strike is going to mean the extinction of the Soviet Union, then there won't be a first strike.
I agree with that. I'm amazed to find myself agreeing with Mr. Buckley, but that is absolutely right.
Well, in that case, let me capitalize on that brief moment of agreement, because I suspect there won't be very many more. Dr. Kissinger, let me turn to you and ask you then, if indeed one accepts either Dr. Sagan's version or the version that we saw here, we are in either case talking about damage and loss of life unparalleled in human history. How is it possible, under any circumstances, to conceive of the use of nuclear weapons?
Well, I think that this film presents a very simple-minded notion of the nuclear problem. And it deals with the most obvious question, that a general nuclear war aimed at cities is a disaster and a catastrophe. I wrote a book on this subject 30 years ago when the notion of general nuclear war first arose. The problem of our period, the problem we have to grapple with, is how to avoid such a war, how to preserve freedom while seeking to avoid such a war, how to create a military establishment that reduces the dangers of such a war, what arms control policies are compatible with this policy, how we handle crises. Those are serious questions. To engage in an orgy of demonstrating how terrible the casualties of a nuclear war are and translating into pictures the statistics that have been known for 3 decades, and then to have Mr. Sagan say it's even worse than this, I would say, what are we to do about this? Are we supposed to make policy by scaring ourselves to death, or is somebody going to make some proposals of where we are supposed to go? And if people don't make that, then I do not believe we are making any contribution. That's my objection to this film. It took this most simple-minded problem that everybody will agree upon. There's nobody in this room who disagrees with the fact that this must not happen. It's how to avoid it that we should be discussing.
Dr. Kissinger, you have brought us precisely to the issue that I think brings us all here together this evening. I think it can go without saying that there's no one in this room, indeed there is probably no sane person in the country who would recommend nuclear war or who would look at that movie and say that what is seen there is some prescription for any solution to any problem. We are here to try to answer the question of what, if anything, can be done. Mr. McNamara, you want to take a crack at that question?
I think much can be done, Mr. Koppel, much that we're not doing. And I want to start by emphasizing, I'm not talking about the Reagan administration. I'm talking about several different administrations, but most of all, I'm talking about the American people. I do not believe the American people understand the world we live in. I do not believe they understand the full risk that we face. There are 40,000 nuclear warheads in the inventories of the U.S. and the Soviet Union today, with a destruction power roughly 1 million times that of the Hiroshima bomb. I don't know any arms expert, and I doubt if anyone in this room believes that in the next 10 to 15 years we can reduce that number by more than half. And we're still going to be living then in a world 15 years from now with 20,000 nuclear weapons. And frankly, I think that's very unlikely to get that low, but just assume that.
What makes you think we'll be alive 15 years from now?
Because in addition to stressing reduction in the numbers of weapons, we need to stress introducing stability in the forces to avoid temptation to either side to preempt, and most of all, we need to introduce steps to reduce the risk that those weapons will be used. And I don't want to take more of my time, but I'll be quite happy during this program to outline a whole series of those steps.
Well, in fact, you stopped short of where I thought you were going. Let us assume for a moment the desirable but probably the unthinkable, and that is that we could somehow agree to do away with all nuclear weapons. We still live with the knowledge of how to make them. How does one live in a nuclear world, one which we will never be able to turn back?
We live in a nuclear world by stressing that this is a plus-sum game that we're working on. There is a commonality of interest between the Soviets and the U.S. to avoid the use of these weapons. That's what that film shows. I totally disagree with those who say it's a disservice to the nation to show the film. Not at all. It's stimulating discussion on exactly the issue we ought to be discussing. There is 1 million times the Hiroshima destruction power out there. We must ensure it not be used. It's equally in the interest of the Soviet Union not to use it. And therefore, there is a basis for coming to agreement. It's going to be very, very difficult. And while we're working on reducing the numbers, which the arms negotiations now in Geneva are pointed to, we should pick up an idea that Henry Kissinger put forward. I put it forward, others have put it forward. It's not enough to reduce numbers. We must increase stability. As long as we have more warheads than they have launchers, they fear we may use those warheads to destroy their launchers and destroy their society. We must begin to introduce stability. Henry has suggested, I've suggested that we move to reducing the ratio of warheads to launchers. This sounds technical. It's not. It simply means increasing the safety of both societies. If we both move that way, we're both better off. There are 15 different actions I could suggest to you, which, if taken today, some unilateral, by the way, we must be more daring, we must be more imaginative as a society, not just as a government, as a society, to reduce this risk. And we must negotiate. We must drag the Soviets into negotiating in our common interest.
Let me pick up a point that was made here a few moments ago and address it to you, General Scowcroft. I believe it was you, Mr. Buckley, who found optimism in Mr. Sagan's pessimism. If indeed we live in a world in which a nuclear exchange of, what, 100 megatons or more, Carl? Is that what we're talking about? If we live in a world in which an exchange of 100 megatons or more means, whether literally or almost literally, the extinction of the human race, have we not reached a point at which any kind of nuclear exchange is unthinkable because of what it may portend?
It may be unthinkable, but deterrence is a very ambiguous notion. It cannot be demonstrated unless it fails, in which case you knew it was not there. Otherwise, it cannot be demonstrated. We have probably very different ideas about deterrence than does the Soviet Union. I think we tend to think that nuclear weapons have done away with war as an instrument of national policy, that it is insane, that the mere existence of nuclear weapons mean that nuclear war cannot happen, as you suggest.
Well, forgive me, there are something like 42, 43, or maybe 44 wars going on in the world right now, so clearly it hasn't done away with war. Are you talking about
nuclear war? I'm talking about a U.S.-Soviet nuclear exchange, like the movie. The Soviet Union, however, both as a result of its history of repeated invasion and the extent to which ideology still motivates its belief that it is surrounded by hostile states, probably wants nuclear war no more than does the United States. but I think realistically anticipates that it could happen. And if it could happen, then they must do their best to prepare for it. And I think it is that is the central issue of deterrence, and that is we must have a military posture which the Soviets, whatever they think about deterrence, whatever they think about the nature of nuclear weapons, can never imagine that resort to them makes sense. I'm not sure that's clear at this point.
Well, when you talk about preparation for it, I assume you mean, among other things, their evacuation procedures, their civil defense program, and things like that. If I understand Carl Sagan and his colleagues, and they seem to be in total agreement with Soviet scientists, all of that is so academic as to be totally pointless. If indeed we're going to have a world in which life itself is essentially extinguished, what difference does it make whether it's extinguished 6 feet underground or extinguished on the surface?
Because I don't think fundamentally we're talking about deliberate decision to launch nuclear war. We're talking about behavior in a crisis where each side is estimating both the posture and the will of the other side, in which case miscalculations can make all the difference between peace and war. And it is in that guise that we must ensure that the Soviet Union can never miscalculate.
Before we slide too far into the technical, Elie Wiesel, we deliberately invited you here so that you would bring a humanistic touch to what otherwise threatens to become either a very technical or a very theoretical kind of discussion. Is there anything that the individual man can do anymore? Is there any point in even discussing that, or is it out of his and her hands?
Not being a nuclear specialist in any way, I'm scared. I'm scared because I know that what is imaginable can happen. I know that the impossible is possible. I've seen the film, and while I was watching it, I had a strange feeling that I had seen it before. Except once upon a time it happened to my people, and now it happens to all people. And suddenly I said to myself, maybe the whole world, strangely, has turned Jewish. Everybody lives now facing the unknown. We are all, in a way, helpless. We are talking about nuclear arms, about the bomb with a capital B, a kind of divinity in itself. Unless those who know militarily what it means, we readers, writers, people, we don't know what it all means. When I hear about 1,000 bombs, megatons, I don't have that kind of imagination. To me, it's an abstraction. What to me all this means is that the human species may come to an end, that millions of children may die, simply because one person somewhere, and I am not so much afraid of the big powers, I'm afraid of the small nations. If not now, maybe 10 years from now, or 20 or 50, a Khomeini will get hold of nuclear weapons. He won't hesitate. He will not have a discussion such as the one as we have here. And it's fear.
Elie Wiesel, you know better than most that during the 1930s in Europe, especially in England, there were discussions not dissimilar from this discussion in which people with the best of motives spoke about pacifism, the need not to go to war, the horror of war, and some historians feel, indeed I would suggest most historians feel, that it was that very sense that brought about precisely what everyone was trying to avoid. I think what Dr. Kissinger was talking about before is precisely that, the danger that in being human about what we've just seen, we may become not only impractical but unwise. Would you like to respond to that notion?
No, I agree with you, and I agree with Dr. Kissinger on that. It's true that pacifism in the absolute sense would be dangerous. We cannot yield our world to dictatorship. We cannot yield our Western society, our democracy, to a totalitarian regime that would have alone, exclusively, a nuclear superiority. It would be foolish. On the other hand, I also know that if we have thousands and more thousands and more thousands of weapons, one day they will explode. Hence my ambivalence, meaning, hence my fear. I do not see realistically a way out. I don't know what could be done.
Dr. Kissinger, you've been writing about dealing with this notion, as you pointed out a few moments ago, for some 30 years. Why do we need all these weapons, which, as Churchill once pointed out, are sufficient now only to make the rubble bounce?
From the point of view of strategic doctrine, or of military strategy, I have been writing for 30 years that these are weapons in search of a doctrine. So I do not want to defend any particular level of forces. The fact, however, is, as Bob McNamara pointed out, we have 40,000 now. If we cut them in half in 10 years, it would be a miraculous achievement. The exact same problem we are discussing tonight will exist at the level of 20,000, and that problem is, how do we avoid their use? That has a component of relationship among the superpowers and among the nuclear powers. It requires us to analyze the design of our forces and to design them in such a manner that there is a minimum incentive for first strike by either side. It requires that we analyze what is likely to cause crisis, and it requires that we do not scare ourselves to death. Because if the Soviet Union gets the idea that the United States has morally disarmed itself and psychologically disarmed itself, then the precise consequences we are describing here will happen. Our problem is to avoid unilateral disarmament and at the same time to develop a policy which eliminates the danger of nuclear war. This is the challenge we face, and we've been going back and forth between extremes of intransigence and extremes of conciliation. And if we do not focus on some of the problems that Bob McNamara mentioned, how we design forces that make for stability, how we communicate over an extended period of time, and what political crises we must seek to avoid and how to handle them in time, then things are going to slide. But the relationship that is being established around this table between the numbers of weapons and the probability of war is, in my view, not true. The kind of war shown in this film is most likely at the lowest numbers of weapons, and has in fact been advocated at the lowest numbers of weapons.
If you can, Dr. Kissinger, explain that briefly. Why?
Well, the theory, there was a theory at one time that was, and that is still used by many groups, which is that if you can kill a certain number of people, and if you can destroy a limited number of cities, what do you need more nuclear weapons for? And then there have been all sorts of calculations made, 200, 300, 400. At any rate, the point is that these weapons have then been advertised as a means of slaughtering civilians. This creates exactly the dilemma we now face. Any statesman, I think Bob will forgive me if I tell him a personal encounter we had. When I became security advisor, I saw for the first time what our plans were. And I called up Bob as the last Secretary of Defense, or at any rate the one I knew best. I asked him to come to the White House. And I first asked him whether he thought these figures were accurate. And then I asked him how he was going to handle that issue if he ever had to, were asked by the President on what to recommend. So this issue has been with us, and it will face every administration. of whatever party. We can't eliminate these weapons completely in a foreseeable time. We should not have a strategy that is designed to maximize casualties, because then if anything goes wrong, we will have Carl Sagan's world. And yet we are assaulted, anyone who seeks that course, on the one side by military technologists who think nuclear weapons are just another kind of weapon, and then by pacifist groups who believe that unless you paint the most horrible picture of nuclear war, it will happen, and you participate in bringing it about. This is why it's been so hard to get the sort of thing that Bob McNamara is talking about.
All right, we're going to have to take a break in just a couple of minutes. Mr. Buckley, go ahead. I may have to cut you off in mid-sentence, though.
Well, I'd like to focus on this business of stabilization, because I think we have moved away from stabilization. There's a line in this movie. They're hearing all this bad news about all the threats that are happening. The Germans are moving and the Russians are moving. And then the girl says, well, we did have a crisis in 1962, and we overcame that, didn't we? There isn't anybody there who says, yes, and we also had a considerable deterrent quality in 1962, which was unambiguous. Question, are we moving towards an ambiguity in our deterrent forces? In the last 4 years, the German Social Democratic Party has turned right around. I would ask Mr. McNamara, is that a sign of stabilization, or precisely the contrary? But it's by seeing this kind of thing, which, by the way, they all saw before they took that vote last week.
Let me...
Before, and I promise I'll come right back to you so you have an opportunity to answer that question, but before we do that, I need to say this. As we are coming up on the hour, that this is a special edition of ABC News Viewpoint. I'm Ted Cohn. Now then, Mr. McNamara, pick it up, please.
First, we have a stable deterrent today. We do a great disservice to our nation when we say otherwise. And we will have a stable deterrent tomorrow if we act intelligently. I have absolutely no question in my mind about it. But I want to go back to the two conditions that we are facing, and they're not going to change. I was in Berlin today. I had lunch in Berlin. I was at the wall today. We didn't build the wall. The wall was built 22 years ago by the Soviets to hold their people in. They retain it today for exactly the same reason. I'm not arguing whether it's wise or unwise for them to do it. It's a symbol of the tension that exists. Events, possibly beyond their control or ours, may cause these miscalculations that were discussed a moment ago. That's one set of facts. The other set of facts is the 40,000 nuclear warheads that Henry and I agree are unlikely to be cut by more than 50% in the next 10, 15 years. We're going to live for decades in a world of tension and with tens of thousands of warheads, a few hundred of which can cause, pardon me, may I finish, that can cause nuclear winter or destroy civilization. We must learn how to avoid their use. Nobody that I have ever talked to knows how to stop a nuclear war once it's started. Therefore, God's sakes, don't ever start one. That's the first point.
All right. Let Mr. Sagan respond to that, then General Scowcroft, and then, folks, you may as well get ready with your questions because we're going to start involving you with all of the panel. Mr. Sagan?
Let me try to make 3 quick points coming out of the previous discussion. First of all, there is a kind of threshold. It's fuzzy, but it's somewhere around 1,000 strategic weapons at which the nuclear winter could be triggered. If that's the case, it seems to me that the only prudent policy is to get well below that threshold so that no concatenation of computer failure and communications malfunctions and madness in high office could kill everybody on the planet. That seems to me elementary planetary hygiene as well as elementary patriotism. You don't want to have a circumstance in which we can end the human endeavor. Now, I think that with 18,000 strategic warheads in the world, we have 18 times, at least, more weapons than are needed to trigger this catastrophe. If you were well below 1,000 warheads, you would still have an adequate strategic deterrence, and I believe, just as slavery was once in the world and people considered it impossible to change, and it was everywhere. Well, now we have a world in which there's virtually no chattel slavery. Conventional expectations about what is inevitable can be changed if there's political will. And I think that the existence of this catastrophe can provide a political will. Now, just one more thing. We heard from Secretary Schultz in answer to your question, Ted, that it wasn't true that the Reagan administration was building up weapons, that in fact they had reduced weapons, and he mentioned a figure of 1,000 in Europe. Now, those 1,000 weapons in Europe are tactical weapons, not strategic weapons. They are largely obsolete weapons, and they are forward-based weapons, which means that they are vulnerable to capture in case of an attack. Now, what the administration is really doing, according to the Congressional Budget Office, is increasing the inventory of strategic warheads from 9,000 in the United States to 14,000. We are going in the wrong direction.
Carl, forgive me. Let us leave it in those general terms, because I must confess statistics leave my mind reeling, and I suspect everybody else's too. General Scowcroft, you want to respond to the general thrust of what Dr. Sagan was saying?
Yes. There are two basic truths. We are not going to disinvent nuclear weapons, as Henry said. The knowledge, and as Bob said, the knowledge of them there, regardless of the number, the knowledge is there. In some respects, the lower the numbers, the more unstable the situation, and the more the encouragement for other powers to acquire nuclear weapons.
That's the second time that's been said now. Dr. Kissinger said it a moment ago. Explain it one more time. Why is less more in this case?
Because if each side, if the Soviet Union, the United States, has only 1,000 weapons, or each only 500, that encourages other powers to become major nuclear powers in a way that they can do because the numbers are relatively small.
Well, in that case, what you're sketching out is a world in which, by definition, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union can ever afford to fall below a certain excessive level.
I think for the short-term future, that may be true. I think the two truths are that we are in a nuclear age, and secondly, we do have a fundamental antagonism with the Soviet Union, which we may be able to ameliorate, but which for the foreseeable future is not going to end. Now, the question is, what do we do about it? And I agree with Bob McNamara that we are not going to get rid of nuclear weapons. The important thing is, as the President's Commission on Strategic Forces underlined, is to improve the stability, to integrate our weapon systems programs and our arms control, to reduce the chances that in a crisis, either side will resort to nuclear weapons, feeling it can gain an advantage.
All right,
and
gentlemen,
that can be done.
I have 100 questions buzzing in my mind, but I suspect that there are at least 200 people out there. The gentleman over here in about the third row, go ahead, sir, it's your question.
Secretary Schultz has said tonight that there's a lot more to do. Mr. McNamara said tonight that we have to increase stability while at the same time being much more imaginative. Mr. Kissinger said that we need a policy that will one day eliminate the need for these type of weapons.
I'll tell you what, help me out so that you don't set an example here that I don't want anyone else to follow. Don't tell us what we have already heard. Ask your question, please.
Okay, the question is it not possible to somehow develop a technological end run to find a solution? That might be a space-based defense system, a system that would render nuclear weapons obsolete, and I'd like for the panelists to comment on this.
All right, we're hearing from the high frontier school of thought, right?
That would be correct.
All right, who would like to pick it up? Dr. Kissinger, high frontier?
I don't know enough about the space technology to have a judgment on whether it is technically possible to do this. The debate on the nuclear issue has taken the paradoxical form that whenever a defense system has been proposed, it has been opposed by many of the groups that are dedicated to disarmament because they're afraid that anything that reduces the impact of a nuclear war also increases the willingness to engage in it. And therefore there has been a tendency to deprecate any possible defense systems. I don't particularly, I haven't studied or I don't know anything about whether the space system, I do not believe, however, as a general proposition, that there is one reliable technological means on the basis of which you can say that now the danger of nuclear war has been eliminated. On the other hand, I also do not like this undifferentiated discussion of all nuclear wars taking Carl Sagan's form. And
what are you saying with that last point? Are you suggesting
what I'm saying with this point is I believe, if it is true that we live in a world in which we are doomed to have nuclear weapons, and if it is true that someday there could be an accident, then it is also true that together with all the measures that have been discussed, we have a moral and political obligation to think of procedures, strategies, and methods to keep the war from mindlessly escalating into the sort of thing that we have seen on television here, and not to talk ourselves into the frame of mind that the first time a nuclear weapon is used, it must end with the destruction of hundreds of millions of people and a nuclear winter.
Carl Sagan, pick up, if you will, on A, the question that was asked, but B, also the point that Dr. Kissinger made, namely that defensive systems, and for example, at one point we were in the process of building an anti-ballistic missile system in this country, that defensive systems are destabilizing because they may lull the side that has it into a sense of security that would permit that side to then launch nuclear weapons on the other side.
Well, on the space-based systems, for them to have any adequacy to stop a significant strike, they have to have a technology which does not exist today, which the best experts in the field say cannot exist. In any case, something which would cost enormous amounts of money, that would have to be deployed on a absolutely unprecedented scale, and which is vulnerable to the simplest kinds of countermeasures. So my sense is that the ballistic missile defense system that is being talked about, and there are a variety of them, and obviously we don't want to get into the details, is dangerous, A, because it lulls us into thinking that we can get away from this problem without the kinds of confidence building and stabilizations that Dr. Kissinger and Secretary McNamara have talked about.
All right, let's go to questions. The lady in about the fifth row back. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
What are we to do 20 to 25 years from now when the superpowers no longer have the decision-making power about whether nuclear war will or will not occur? And this could be a small-scale nuclear war as opposed to the type of war that we've seen in the movie where, complete devastation everywhere. What about the point that Mr. Wiesel raised earlier about a Khomeini or a Gaddafi having that capability?
Mr. McNamara, do you want to pick up on that?
Well, I would say several things. First, we need to maintain and tighten our non-proliferation policy. We've allowed it to become weak, and we, by that means, have contributed to the problem this lady is pointing to. Secondly, we need to establish procedures that will ensure that our nuclear forces are not triggered by a terrorist launch of a weapon or by an accident, mechanical or human failure. And we need to ensure that the Soviets are following the same procedures. These are the kinds of actions that we need to take in our common interest to avoid launch against terrorists thinking we're launching against a Soviet attack, or launch in the event of mechanical or human failure. And one of those procedures that we ought to take unilaterally, and then we ought to try to persuade them to adopt as well, is to state publicly, we will never, never, never launch on warning. We have not yet said that, nor have they.
You have just raised, I'm afraid, an issue of such controversy that I don't think I can just let it go by. Launch on warning is the notion that if anyone were to fire any missiles in our direction, we would not wait for them to land, but the president would give the command that our land-based nuclear missiles, our ICBMs, it's the old use them or lose them notion, right?
Yes.
And is that in point, well, I'm not even sure if you can discuss it. Is that our policy?
We have not said it is not our policy, and the Secretary of the Air Force, within the past few weeks in California, has stated that the administration is unwilling to state it's not our policy. And the Soviets, within the past several weeks, have, in their press, indicated that the Pershing missile deployment to Europe is likely to trigger their launch-on warning.
All right, but
now, I think we're both insane if we ever launch on warning.
All right,
because the warnings may be false.
Is that not...
As they have been in the past.
Is that not another one of the paradoxes that seem to dot this nuclear minefield unless we maintain that level of doubt in our adversaries' minds that it might happen? They might be tempted to try
No, absolutely not. Because our forces are invulnerable, and so are theirs. There's absolutely no reason for the Soviets to launch on warning, and there's absolutely no reason for us to launch on warning.
Anybody disagree with that?
Yes. I actually, I do not believe we should launch on warning. I don't know any administration that would have launched on warning, and I doubt that this administration
then we should say so.
Would launch on warning. Now the question is, does the concept of launching on warning make a nuclear war more likely? The argument for not saying what we are doing and will be doing is that if you assert it, it makes the calculations of a potential attacker somewhat simpler, because he can then determine exactly what is going, or at least he can try to turn it into a mathematical problem. If you don't say it, there is an element